Good afternoon. My name is James Season. I am the Director of Development for the new Institute for Molecular Engineering. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Professor Steve Sibener. Steve Sibener is the Carl William Eisendrath Distinguished Service Professor, Department of Chemistry, and the James Franck Institute. He's made seminal contributions to chemical physics, surface and materials chemistry, and nanoscience. He's conducted pioneering molecular beam studies of gas phase combustion processes, mechanistic studies of interfacial catalytic reactions, and precision measurements of the atomic level dynamics of interfaces. His program is now also examining molecular self-organization, polymer dynamics, biological structures and interfaces, atomically resolved studies of molecular reactivity, superconducting, radio frequency materials for accelerators, and nanoscience projects that may lead to the development of new materials. But some things that you may not know about Professor Sibener. One is he lives in the home once occupied by Enrico Fermi, the Italian physicist best known as the father of the atomic bomb and his contributions to development of quantum theory, nuclear, and particle physics. But like Fermi, Professor Sibener is primus inter pares, first among equals, and able to do both theoretical and experimental work and be excellent at both. As evidence of when I visited him in his office, a rather impressive collection of champagne bottles neatly arranged in his office from each of his doctoral students, including a non-alcoholic sparkling cider for the one who didn't drink. He has also chaired 2 university-wide committees in 2007 that led to the establishment of the Institute for Molecular Engineering, which officially launched in July of 2011 with the hiring of our founding Pritzker director, Matt Terrell. Among the many hats that Steve wears for the university, he's currently the director of the university's Institute for Molecular Engineering Water Research Initiative. Today he will give a talk whose title is inspired by the poem by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Water, water everywhere, nor any drop to drink, is a talk about the University of Chicago's response to the water crisis and how we are safeguarding and extending the world's water resources. Steve has accepted his appointment to the Chicago faculty in 1979, where he was still a graduate at UC Berkeley, and he's been here ever since. He served in many leadership positions at the University of Chicago and elsewhere as director of the university's Material Research Science and Engineering Center, or MERSEC, and the director of the Multi-University Centers for Materials Chemistry in the space environment, and as director of the university's interdisciplinary efforts within the James Franck Institute. He played a key role in the conceptualization and design of the new interdisciplinary research facility, the Gordon Center for Integrative Science. Will you please help me welcome the Carl William Eisendrath Distinguished Service Professor, Steve Sibener.
That was quite a generous introduction, but thank you very much. But I'm glad you're all here today. We're going to talk about some issues globally in water and sustainability, and the university's response that's building steam rapidly to these kind of issues. So as you heard, we're going to talk about some of these matters now. Now, I have a long-term love of water besides drinking it in various forms. I come from a crazy family where people loved to ice skate for generations. Don't ask me how that occurred in New York City. So I really care about water being supplied in all ways. So water everywhere. Why water? What do we hope to be doing with this? So as you see here, we have a map of the world showing the scarcity of this resource, which you probably are aware of. You can see in the western United States, a highly stressed environment, red is bad. You see a massive band around the slightly northern hemisphere in Europe and Asia, where vast populations of the world live. It's a very serious issue. Australia is largely a desert, in case some of you haven't been there, and except for a band around the coasts, it's parched, and this problem is only going to get worse as time goes forward. Now, in the United States, this is just a snapshot taken about 2 years ago, but it changes, every year. It shows you again just the chronic shortage of water, in especially the Southwest, Texas, Arizona, and when it doesn't snow very much in the Sierra Nevada, the kind of issues you have in the West in particular. And so it's a chronic problem, not just for the world, but for the United States as we deplete some of these underground aquifers and we need a response. Now, this is a very telling slide. It shows you where the water resides on our planet. You have here the oceans representing about 97% of the water in the world, and it's not fit for drinking or agriculture. Of the remaining 3%, a lot of it is in the ice caps and the glaciers, which you hear a lot about. It's also in the groundwater, and a little bit it's surface water. And that little bit, when you break it out, here's the fresh water supply of the world as it exists today. We have here lakes representing about 87% of this water, so we're very fortunate in Chicago to be next to the Great Lakes. We have swamps and we have rivers. You see the mighty rivers of the world like the Nile, and look at that fraction, very small percentage of water that they represent for the world, and yet that's where it allows all of human activity to occur. So the expression you're all going to be hearing a lot about from your federal government, if not yet, but imminently, is the energy-water nexus. What that really means is that there's a direct interplay between energy consumption and production of clean water artificially. And it is also not a global statement. It very much depends upon where in the world you are. If you're in Saudi Arabia, you have tremendous energy resources, and because of that, you can make water that's fresh in sometimes very expensive ways, but you can do it. In other parts of the world where energy is scarce, you need to be much more clever. So there are very big issues there, and this issue of the Department of Energy and the EPA and others being seemingly separated, it's all about to change hugely. They're linked, as you will see in this talk. We have to understand the effective location, as I just said. You need to know the technologies and approaches that can adapt to this in a regulatory environment. You have policy choices that have to be made without more comprehensive data than we have today. You have to begin. We need to improve coordination of these kinds of issues. And there are also uncertainties in resources that can occur. You have trouble in the world, you have droughts, you have floods. It can change, instantaneously. So why are we here? All projections tell us that the amount of water in the world is going to become more precious as time goes on. No one says it's a stable situation. As the population of the world grows, people consume water. As a large amount of the world's population strive and deserve to live at the standards of the first world, it just gets worse in the sense of consumption of water, and you need to have a plan to deal with this. This shows projections out to about 2025, and it really shows you again areas of chronic supply shortage, and it may be worse than this as time goes on. Even in the Great Lakes, so you don't, in spite of having this massive supply of fresh water, there are metrics one can take where you ask, how much water are you withdrawing today per year versus the replenishment of those resources? And this shows you a stress map of the Great Lakes, which also shows you that we're consuming water, especially in the eastern United States, at great ways. And as you may know, even in the greater Chicagoland area, that they're not all plugged into the Chicago Water District. Chicago, the city, has this amazing water supply, right? We have these things near Navy Pier. You'd never even know they were there, and they do treatment, they do supply. It's really an immense achievement. But if you go in the suburbs, they draw water from wells or other supplies, and they're stretched. Now, if you look here, this is a metric that I think is one you all should appreciate. How important are the Great Lakes? Well, again, a vast amount of North America's resources here, 84%. It represents 20% of the entire world's freshwater supply. These are stress levels that I find very informative personally. It tells you, if it didn't rain anymore, how much of the lake are you consuming this year versus next year versus the year after. You can see that Lake Ontario is tremendously stretched. Even though it's given its size, it's about a 6-year supply. Whereas Lake Superior, it's about 200 years. So we can all move up to Minnesota and live a good life up there for a long time. Maybe our great-great-grandchildren will hit the wall. It also supplies the water for 25% of Canada's agriculture and about 7% of the United States. So it goes without saying it's a tremendous resource. Now, what about water consumption? Has some interesting stories here to tell you. There's a difference. There's water withdrawals, which is water that we take out from somewhere and we use and we can return. And there's water that we consume, water where basically you pour it for agriculture or you drink it in the morning, right, with your orange juice. So there's a difference in those, and it's a very important difference because the water that's withdrawn and can be recycled and reused can go around and around and around, like in a power plant, whereas the water you withdraw is gone, that you consume is gone. Of the water withdrawal, you should appreciate the drivers. There's irrigation for agriculture is huge. The production of food is the largest consumer of clean water there is in the world, by far. And we have cooling of all sorts, thermoelectric power, cooling of power plants, cooling of everything. And so that's very important. But when you move on to this diagram, which is in some ways more important for consumption, look at irrigation. It's huge, right? It's this gigantic 80% type number for the system. And then you take a look at the small amount that's used here in households, and you can take a look at that number. And you have commercial breakouts, domestic. And I find this a really worrisome one. Some of you may have told your children or your parents told you, get out of the shower in the morning, you're wasting all that water. It's all true. But when you compare it to the amount of water that's used to give your quality of life, the amount that comes out of your faucet is crucially important, but it's by no means the majority. We'll have some slides on how much water we all use in the United States versus elsewhere. So what's the University of Chicago beginning to think about and to imagine? Well, to create fresh water requires reuse of water. It requires new supplies of water. And what is crucially important, as you'll see, and it's happening very rapidly, is generating potable water from seawater, from salt water. And that's going to be huge around the world. It's already huge in the Middle East. What you'd like to do is to make technologies based on advanced materials and processes that are more efficient. You've all heard about issues like global warming. Well, to make clean water costs energy. Nothing's free. And you want to be able to make the water in a way where it's done efficiently, it uses the least amount of energy. So there's room for improvement. Technologies in the 1950s and 60s are being superseded by new methods. You have nanoscience type initiatives, which we're working on quite a bit here in University of Chicago and Argonne and Ben-Gurion University. And you would like them to do one of two things, as always. You'd like them to be revolutionary and new and just work better, or you want to replace old processes with more efficient ones. Either of those are winners, right? You don't have to do everything has to reinvent the wheel, but there are advantages in that. So you want to have technologies that improve utilization of resources. You need new membrane technologies for purification. You need to remediate water in more clever ways. And again, this energy-water nexus needs to be considered always. So why molecular engineering? Well, there's tremendous opportunities here. There's a socio-economic impacts. We need fresh water, of course. We need it for agriculture. We need it for home consumption. We need to reduce the energy demand for this purification steps to occur. It's a source of development. There's going to be new companies, new world-scale industries are going to grow. They're growing already, as you'll see, but it's just the beginning. It's going to be much larger. And you have jobs. The focus area here initially is on new membrane technologies largely. These are for purification and desalination. You want them to be either, as I said, more efficient, or do things in a totally new way. So if you think about a water plant, you can see the plant out in Lake Michigan, and you draw in the water. You have filters that have to be cleaning up biologicals, particulates, chemicals, and then it meets U.S. standards, and you can drink it. It's an amazing water supply the United States has, right? It's safe. You would like to figure out how to do that in better ways, and we'll discuss. Another issue are things like in plantings. Maybe you've heard about drip irrigation in Israel. It's a phenomenal importance to the world. What is the most efficient way to grow the food that we eat? One way is you can flood the area. You open up your hydrants, go back to the 1900s. Or you can have drip on demand. When this plant says, I'm thirsty, you get a few drops of water. You still grow the same quality of food. Just one of them is very wasteful. And you saw the pie charts that I showed you on the lever arms on where the water goes, right? And so irrigation is huge. You need new types of biologicals. You would like to have plants that are drought resistant, of course, genetic engineering, or just breeding, if you wish, which is really genetic engineering, right? You have microorganisms in the stream, in soil. You have pathogens that you need to worry about, and the groundwater interface. You've all heard about fracking, and there are issues with that. So another issue is trace chemicals. We live in this first world society. Everything we do has chemicals in it. Chemicals are not bad. We are chemicals, to be clear. But certain ones you'd like to not have to worry about. There were some plastic drinking bottles, right, that were banned just a couple of years ago. They had trace hormones at a very, very, very low level. You don't want that going into the water supply. You don't want, when I take an Advil, you'd like to know it's metabolized when I have a headache. You don't want to worry about it going into the drinking water. There are other pharmaceuticals that are used widely, and you'd like to know that that's not in the water coming out of your tap. So you need ways of efficiently scrubbing those types of chemicals. So you have organic chemicals. You also have greenhouse gases, which one needs to worry about always. We've heard a lot about that this week from President Obama. So we need to worry about this. Now, this is an interesting slide. It again shows you, for each of you, on the average, what water and energy that you need to have the quality of life that we all have, that we're blessed with. Well, you have to make food. You have to have electricity. And look at these numbers here, right? This is the gallons per energy unit per day we need. And then this is the amount for direct use. That's your drinking water, bathing, other things at home. So you should understand when you're living in your nice houses and you're using water, behind it is a factor of 10 more water that's being used to support that quality of life. Okay? Now, this is a slide that I looked at for a while, and it was a real eye-opener. This is going to touch on water, but also energy. This shows the amount of water we need. This is a logarithmic scale. You're all UChicago graduates, so you just see that without me explaining anything. But basically, there's a tremendous variance in the amount of water it takes to produce energy per BTU of power delivered. You can look at that and digest it, but the one that I just feel I need to call out because it's such a topic of current concern is this one. A lot of us have E85. I hope I'm not insulting any farmers here from Nebraska or Kansas, but we hear about making energy. Energy grown from corn, biofuels. Biofuels in general is very important. We're developing plants genetically that are going to make a lot of fuel per energy per water, right? That's coming. But you don't want to necessarily just take corn. Corn feeds animals. Corn feeds people. And it takes a lot of water to grow it. But what you really should also see is the amount of energy it takes to make that E85. So you always read about this. It's certainly of strategic importance, right? Everyone would like to be using domestic gasoline rather than fuels from the Middle East. It just makes sense, or from Venezuela. It just, it makes a lot of sense politically. But you have to understand the costs here are really driven by strategic needs that I just described, not by efficiency in water utilization, not in power utilization efficiency. And so one needs to really question whether this is the best use. Whereas things made from cellulosic ethanol and others that are being developed can be 1 or 2 orders of magnitude better. Corn's a really bad idea for this. Okay, so you also hear a lot about fracking. I saw a slide last month that to me was an amazing eye-opener. There's no longer a discussion, is fracking going to be the major source of oil and gas in the United States for a generation? I saw a satellite image of North Dakota taken 20 years ago where it was dark except for 1 or 2 cities. If you see that same satellite image today, you see these lines in a grid all across North Dakota and actually Texas, and it's spreading to other states. If you think this is in the early levels of development, you and I are all mistaken. It's out of the box completely. It's a huge technology. It's very important, which it means it has to be done in a way that's respectful for the water supplies of the country and the world. But there's no going back. What you'd like to do is figure out ways of doing it efficiently. So why Chicago? Well, forgive the first bullet, but there it is. You're all from here, right? But we have really good sciences, basic sciences at Chicago. We've always had that. There's also Argonne National Laboratory, which has great applied sciences. And as you'll hear in a moment, we have our new partnership with Ben-Gurion University, the Negev, which has phenomenal technology, leading worldwide technology in water production and conservation. There's a commitment to innovation at all 3 of these institutions. We have diverse expertise here at the university. You all, some of you are the famous School of Economics, law school, social science, policy. And we're a small enough school where people talk to each other and we all know who we are. It's not a huge school where, they're somewhere else. And so the idea that this is starting out with a technical and science program should be clear to you. You have to start somewhere. But it's going to grow into these issues of economics, commodification of water, legal issues of water rights, all sorts of issues there. And so the last thing I'd like to mention, I'm not sure you're seeing it on any tours next few days, but on 53rd Street, there's something that many of you thought you'd never see in Chicago, is that we've partnered with the city, but we now have the Chicago Innovation Exchange, which is going to open this fall. It's basically going to be a huge incubator. It has space for lots of people, and it's going to be a connection to venture capital, discussions with corporations, and hopefully as things from all over the university flow, going to create new companies and jobs. So it's very important for the university and for the city. So why Ben-Gurion University? Well, I like this, right? So, the Israelis have a long-standing interest in controlling the flow of water. I'm not sure this is Charlton Heston standing over there, but you all know the reference. And so, we need to consider their expertise. It goes back a long, long time. So, Israel's survival, one can argue, besides, defense of its borders, obviously strategically depends upon a water supply that's guaranteed. It just has to be there. And it's developed over years, what's arguably the most expert production and utilization, conservation of water program in the world. Ben-Gurion University, the Negev, was created, and the Zuckerberg Institute in particular, to guarantee very high technology in these issues. It's a fairly new university, and its target is to do the developmental applied science all the way to pilot programs and then to world-scale plants that you'll see in a moment. So they're a natural partner with us in that they're aligned with the vision. We have phenomenal strength, as we've said earlier, in the basic sciences, argon and applied sciences. They have the engineering expertise, and so it makes a great sense. At Ben-Gurion University, which is now officially our partner, they have only 2 departments, hydrology and microbiology, and desalination and water treatment. That is what its license is. It's targeted completely at that. They have programs for education, which we're partnering with, And, you know, more than approximately half of the water in Israel now comes in this way. So this was given some grounding about only a year ago. Maybe you've read about this in your alumni magazines. But in March of a year ago, so a little over a year ago, there was a formal agreement signed by the presidents of Chicago and Ben-Gurion to establish this link. There was a workshop in Israel last April where planning was put in place to begin. There are now research exchangers. I have a partner, two partners there, one of whom was here last month and telling us about new catalysts that we're going to be working on in our laboratory that they developed. There's going to be exchanges of faculty and students, so there's going to be a lot of opportunity for summer research for undergraduates to go there. All sorts of partnerships are going to grow, we hope. And business ventures would be nice. I'll leave that to all of you Booth graduates, some of you, but we'll see how that goes. So this is the picture you have to see. This is where it began with the signing of the agreement, and we have Rahm Emanuel there, and also Shimon Peres, 90 years old, who this was actually done. So it's at a very high level, and it's taken very seriously. So let's talk a little about where we are and how we're getting there. So all things have to start small. If any of you would like to give $1 billion, we can skip this phase completely. But you know, but basically, we had a competition. We decided for seed grants that were restricted to technical issues to start. So not yet economics or policy. So engineering and science. There were many white papers, pre-proposals that were generated, and the requirements in that were, of course, scientific excellence. That's always number one. But also, they had to have a partnership with either Chicago and Ben-Gurion, Argonne and Ben-Gurion, or all three. So nobody could go it alone, at least in this initial program. So we had a competition, and there were 5 seed grants that were awarded fairly recently, with funding from all 3 institutions to prime the pump. In Chicago, it has people from chemistry, like me, physics, evolution and ecology, geosci, molecular engineering, and others in BSD and Argonne Laboratory. The topics, as you'll see in a moment, were nanoscience, biodecontamination, a very interesting one, aquifer supplies, membranes, and catalysts. What's coming next are broadening into policy, as I said, in economics, law, business. Fundraising is ongoing. It's been launched officially now as part of the campaign and other places within the philanthropy engine. And hiring, we hope, will happen as we begin to identify world leaders, probably starting with senior faculty, across departments actually, and then junior people to follow. These are the grants, and we can talk more about that later or offline, but basically several of them deals with filters. At Argonne, there's one on new types of membranes for filtering water and optical purification. I'm very proud of this one because Seth Darling, about 10 or 12 years ago, was one of my great grad students of the past. He's been his own man for a decade already, but he's participating. There's one on biofouling and biofilms, and this involves Matt Terrell from Chicago. There's one on catalytic wet oxidation, and this involves myself and also Dmitry Talipin, who's a synthetic nanoscience chemist at Chicago. If it's not obvious, I should say it once. So you all know what a filter is. A filter is where you put something through, and it collects the stuff that you don't want coming out on the other side. Right? You can have filters for sediment, for particles. You can also have filters for chemicals. You also can have filters for biologicals. So filters, they're everywhere, right? Your car has lots of filters. There's another way. The problem with filters is that when they get full of the stuff they're filtering, they no longer filter. They get full, right? So you have to back flush them and wash the junk out of them, and then you continue. So the duty cycle isn't continuous. Or you need to replace them. And all of that costs time and money. The other option for some things is to make ones which are catalytically active materials. And that means if you have some chemicals, maybe you don't want to filter them, but you want to pass them through a medium that will render them harmless, remediate them, and then you can go on and drink it, right? And so that's something where you're not trapping particles. You just basically clean them up on the fly. And that's the project that I'm involved in. And you also have biofilms again. I'm not sure you know this, but biofilms are really, really hard things to deal with. Once you get colonies of bacteria, they're very self-protective. Slime, right? And it's very hard to just kill that because they develop protective mechanisms as colonies, and those are called biofilms. And so there are issues of can you make filters that don't trap bacteria to begin with? Think Teflon for bacteria or other things. But the one I saved for last to mention is a very unique program. It has to do with the ability to date aquifers and the flow of water. And I'm going to get a little technical for a minute. So far, I hope it's been just the perfect level. You'll tell me. But it turns out that there's radiation, coming in from outer space all the time. And they can create trace isotopes when they strike water. There's trace amounts of krypton in water, really trace amounts. And those kryptons can be converted to krypton-81 when they're bombarded, and other isotopes too. And it turns out that that has a half-life that's very good for dating. And it means that if water is on the surface, it's constantly reaching a steady state. That is, radiation comes from above, you make isotopes that are radioactive in very, very, very trace amounts. I mean, we all drink it every day, don't worry, it's very safe. Then it goes underground into aquifers, and those trace isotopes begin to decay away, so the concentration drops. And then it comes up in your well in your backyard, and you can see how much is there. And so you have a sense of the water cycle in aquifers and wells. And so Z.T. Liu is actually an atomic physicist. He makes traps that can hold things at ultra-low temperatures, but it's a way of concentrating and detecting krypton-81 optically. And when you do that, you can look at water flow. And he's gotten a lot of press in the last few months. It's all over, Google him and you'll see in papers around the world. But they're dating aquifers in Israel at the moment. There are 2 huge aquifers, and they want to know the water dynamics. You read a lot about the big aquifers in the United States that go from North Dakota down to the southwest, and how they're surviving nicely up north, and they're getting overtapped down south. And so those kind of issues are important. So, and then there are 2 other projects which are not part of the Ben-Gurion Initiative, but they're being funded also to look at protein interactions in water and new types of nanofilters. So there are really 7 of these projects that are now underway. So what's the big deal? Salt in water is the big deal. I love this thing. I have to put a credit here. I apologize. I hope it wasn't one of you in the audience, but I took that from the web. It was so cool. But basically, if we could just turn the oceans into potable water, this discussion ends, right? So everything goes back to Aristotle. It is the UChicago. You all had the core. But basically, the question of distillation was known a long time ago. The other name that always comes up, I really wish I had met him, Pliny the Elder. There must have been 20 Pliny the Elders because, it comes up all the time. But he wrote about this in Distillation and Condensation on Fleece. Alexander, 200 AD, talked about distillation and condensation. Jean Larrey, the voyage to Brazil. You all heard about Captain Cook. Desalinization is documented as they circumnavigated the world. This is all by distillation, if it's not obvious. People knew that you could boil salt water, condense the vapor, and have fresh water. That's been known for thousands of years. Right? So if you're ever stuck in the desert, take that mirror, aim it at some bad water, and make your still. You'll be able to hang in there. Huge breakthroughs, though, occurred in this last few years with what are called reverse osmosis membranes. Now, I teach physical chemistry. Actually, I'm making up grades today, so the quarter's almost over. But you all know, of course, that osmotic pressure is something that has to be overcome if you want to extract salt from water. You all took a course with me or my predecessors, right? And so it turns out that you need about 25 atmospheres of pressure to extract, to push salt water against the right membrane to have the salt be extracted. You can't just have a filter. It goes back to thermodynamics, right? You have to really deal with it in a more sophisticated way. And so these membranes are important. You also know them from electrodialysis, perhaps, but they're very important in that they can become potentially very, very energy efficient. Remember the energy-water nexus? Here we go again. Boiling water and condensing it, you can do it. You're going to go broke doing it. You're going to dump tons of CO2 in the atmosphere doing it. Reverse osmosis is almost at the theoretical limit, as you'll see in a few minutes. It's the way you want to do this. Today, this is not a curiosity. 300 million people or more probably, this is a slide a year old, depend upon synthetic human-made water, potable water, to live. And that's going to be 1 billion people in 10 years. It's just, it's just the way it is. So this slide at the bottom, I hope you can see it, talks about if you're making desalination, the amount of energy you need, thermal energy it also uses. Remember I talked about cooling of power plants? So they always you can't have a power plant for free. If you really got an A from me, remember the Carnot cycle, you always have waste heat, right? You can't beat that. So you have to really deal with energy that's useful and energy that's waste. And then you have the total power. And you can look at what you use for flash, which is basically fancy stills. And then all on the right, I hope I can't read it from here, you have reverse osmosis. And if you look in the lower right-hand corner, those with good eyesight, you can see that the kilowatts, I'm going to go off the podium for a second, but you can see that the kilowatt hours per cubic meter are about 3 with reverse osmosis. And here are all sorts of unit conversions so that whether you're from across the pond from here, you can worry about energy in BTUs or kilowatt hours. Okay. So if I asked you today, how many desalination plants are there in the world? How about somebody take a guess? Don't read the answer on the slide. Anybody want to guess? Yes. 15,000. You're only off by a factor of 15. So today there are about 15,000 of these plants operating in the world, and it's growing weekly. This isn't a concept. It's making water in amazing amounts. There are plants listed here. This stands for seawater reverse osmosis plants. These are the largest ones as it was about 2 years ago. It is now out of date, which you'll see in a moment. Israel has Sosa Rec, Algeria, Australia, Singapore, Saudi Arabia, Australia again. Australia, remember? I told you, it's a desert there. It really is a desert. A very limited water supply. They have lots of ocean. And so these plants are online producing vast amounts of water. This is a picture from the Ashkelon plant in Israel. So the last year or two has been tremendous innovations in this. This is developing rapidly. So Sosa Rec opened fairly recently. It's the next water plant in Israel. It's about 600,000 cubic meters per day, and it's running. Okay? It looks like this. It's not that far from Tel Aviv. It has cascades of a new design, 16-inch vertical reverse osmosis. The other ones prior to this were 8-inch. The water flows per system are much higher than they were just 5 years ago. It's really the state of the art in the world. And the target price today is less than $1 per cubic meter. We'll talk about that in a moment. This one plant, I mean, these are world-scale plants. These are not small things. Is 20% of Israel's water came online with this plant last year. This is a quote from the head of Israel's Water Authority. We have all the water we need, not quite yet, but it'll be that way in just a few years. Even in the year in which we have the worst year yet with regard to precipitation. Abraham Tena, head Desalinization division. This is a huge revolution. Right? Any of you live in Chicago or in the northern parts of the country? I bet you paid a fair amount to heat your homes this winter. Every winter, but this winter. I live in a 100-year-old house, as you heard in the introduction. My heating bill is a lot more than $1 a day, right? The culture of paying for this type of water is changing rapidly in the world, given this plant in Israel. These plants in Israel, though, are going to be sold, and in South Korea makes world-scale plants. It's changing the way this is happening. Plants in San Diego are opening. The United States, as you know, has oceans on several sides, and so this is just coming on strong. This plant is the water for 1.5 million people. One plant. And they're building redundancies so that if one plant breaks down, that they'll still have water. Okay. So this is in Saudi Arabia. And I'm really laughing, James, at this one slide because I put this talk together, maybe 2 years ago. And it turned out that this plant, the contracts were let for this plant in 2010, right? And South Korea won. And for those of you who think there's not big money involved, so this one plant, not complete, just the plant, is $1.5 billion. And it turns out that this came online very recently, press release April 2014. This went from an open field to producing huge amounts of water in 3 years. So this is a technology that is understood, it's getting better, and it's on a world scale. Saudi Arabia has more than 60% of their water today being made in this manner. South Korea built it, so the technology is worldwide, not just with the United States or Israel or it's China, it's everywhere. This plant is actually in some ways not as modern, if you forgive me, as the Israeli plant in that it's a combination of multi-stage flash, think about a big still, and also reverse osmosis. So the largest reverse osmosis plant in the world is the one I showed you just previously at Sosa Rec. This is the largest plant in the world, period, at the moment. But it's using a combination. And why? Is energy efficiency, of course, is important, but it maybe is a little less important in Saudi Arabia than Israel. Where this is all going, and it's not science fiction, is that there are concerns about global warming. So if all the world's water were made this way, you can use a huge amount of energy. And so what you're going to start seeing in their pilots being developed is solar energy plants next to water plants next to the ocean. You can't do better than that someday. The other key word is cogeneration. This plant has, I think it's on the slide. Yes, there's a 2,400 megawatt power plant co-built with the Saudi water plant. Why? It's so that you get advantages of what's called cogeneration. You have great synergies where the heat from the power plant that isn't used for the power production, the waste heat, can be used as part of the power for the water plant in some indirect ways. So it's much more efficient. Okay, so the total water cost, the TWC, is what you all care about. And as you'll see, it's really quite palatable. This shows you the cost delivered working plants in the world to make that fresh glass of ice water on a hot day. And, it ain't so bad, as we say in New York, right? You got the power demands here per 1,000 gallons, $2 per 1,000 gallons. You need 500 gallons, according to live fairly well from the slide I showed you, $1 a day per person. So if you have a family of $4 a day, $100 a month. It's just that the culture in the world so far is that water is nearly free when it's there, and when it's not free, oh boy, you've got great rationing and problems. Look at California this year. So, one has, and these are amortized costs, right? So this means you build the plant, you run it for 10 years, and what's the cost? This is the real cost. So, if any of you have a cool billion around, it's a very good bet to put that straw outside of Los Angeles. The only problem is if it snows a lot in the mountains on a given winter, you're going to get undersold. So there's questions of price floors and all these things that I'll leave to you Booth graduates. That's not my expertise. But, I'm convinced that having regulation where the price variation is smoothed out, as it is for power, we'll do the same for water. This just shows you, even within one country, the cost can vary by about a factor of 2. You all like quantification, Chicago alumni. But it just shows you when you add up Perth and Sydney plants, they're both just fine. There's plenty of water for you to have at costs that are really quite reasonable. So, how do you make it better? Well, the problem is that you need to basically make everything a little better. If you look at this pie chart, this shows you where the price picture comes from for producing all the water. And the answer is, it comes from improvements on everything. There's not like one horrible thing left to do. The reverse osmosis membranes and that whole procedure was in a factor of, I don't know, 3 or 4 of theoretical, right? So there's not a lot left there. There's delivery of the water, there's the filters, efficiency of the power delivery, all sorts of costs, building the plants. And so there's a lot of opportunity, because these are each billion, they can be, if you make a world scale plant, $1 billion a pop. So there's a lot of things going on here in this space. In the United States, the consumption might be 100 gallons per person per day. Different units here. And this gives you, for desalinated water cost, is about 30 cents. And you go across the world, and we are, we're the old first world. We built our technology when things weren't scarce. Europe has to do a lot better. Africa is desperate. And there's a bare minimum recommendation from the United Nations for survival. And so this gives you a sense of what it costs per day. So if any of you have your billions of dollars in your pocket, I don't know who I'm speaking to, you have the better of me, you can cure a disease in the world, and that's always great. Cure a disease, pick a disease, and eradicate it. You can take that money and also help build water plants for Africa and save hundreds of millions of people's lives. So, everything is always needed. But there are real questions on, if you have that spare $10 billion in your pocket, where do you put it? And it's really a question that, I ask myself, having learned more about this. So you've heard a little bit of water for the 21st century. I've gone 48 minutes, so I think I'm 2 minutes shy of my target. I have a few last slides which give some details of the seed projects with Israel. But let me just conclude by giving you, again, a summary of the vision. So the University of Chicago is just rolling out this water initiative. I'm the current director of this program. And it's going to initially be based on technology. It's going to hopefully expand in new directions as time goes forward. And there's going to be opportunities for education. There's a new grad student who's contacted me for next year in IME who said, I'm going to come if I can work on water research. I don't know. It's whenever I give talks at meetings like this on rare occasion, there's 2 or 3 things that I can't compete with as a physical chemist. Dinosaurs, astronomy, and curing cancer. When I speak back to back with people who do any of those, I'm the sideshow always. I've discovered, I'm adding a 4th thing to that list. When you say we're starting research and initiatives in water, people seem to jump and pay some attention. So I think it's a really great issue for the future of the world and for the university. Thank you very much. If there's any questions, a couple anyway. Yeah, sure.
You talked about seawater desalinization. Are there any special problems that? Yeah, you talked about seawater desalinization. I was wondering if there are any special problems about salty aquifers.
So I'm glad you asked that. Let me go back and go forward a bit, in true Chicago style. But basically, there's seawater. There's a lot of brinish, brackish water in the United States and around the world where it's not fit for drinking or agriculture, but it's not so bad. It has less salt per gallon than ocean water. So anything I've said here today about energy requirements and costs get better. So I focused on the ocean for obvious reasons, but you're perfectly correct in that cleaning up other supplies of water that are in aquifers that might be somewhat brinish, right? It only gets easier. The other thing, though, which I think you also maybe was sort of going to touch on in your next question, was that after you do this, you have to get rid of the salt water. That is, and so the kind of numbers that we've talked about means that you have a place to dump the water that's actually more concentrated. These are the numbers where you pass through the water once or twice, but once you make the salt water double salt water, it just gets harder and harder. So, you have to have a place, and if you are near an ocean, it's not a problem, right? If you're doing this in an aquifer in the middle of the country, somewhere in the middle of Africa, then there are issues also of the waste and where you put it. But that's not the biggest issue, though.
Yeah, isn't this whole approach wrong? Isn't the problem that there are too many people, not that there's not enough water, and so that we should be looking at reducing population rather than improving, because the people are just going to keep breeding the more water you give them, and eventually we're going to be the point where we'll be out of water again.
As they say, that's above my pay grade. but I would say the following, that even for the population of the world as it is today, so let's say, the world stops growing tomorrow morning. There's an awful lot of people in the world that have nowhere near the quality of life that you and I do. And, this technology is going to help.
What sort of investigations are being done on potential environmental impacts with respect to the ocean when having the water extracted and then receiving the briny water, the very salty water? I'm aware there's 90% of the water in the oceans, but along the coastal areas, they're used to a very delicate chemical balance in the water system.
Right. No, there's a question of dilution of this, and how far out does the intake pipe go, and how far out does the effluent go. And I think if you have oceans, you're in reasonable shape. Also, you may collect them in salt ponds. They have a lot of minerals in the salt. And there's questions of maybe you don't put it back in all places, but you actually you consume the waste. So again, I think depending on where you are in the world, there's probably different winning solutions. Yeah.
It just needs to also be considered. It's not a free solution.
That's right. But I think in San Diego, or in the Middle East, Australia, I don't think there's a worry of hurting the water system, the ecosystem in the vicinity of the coasts. I think it's not. It dilutes very quickly. 1 million gallons a day sounds like a lot. It's 20% of the water needs of Israel, but it's compared to the size of the ocean, it's truly minuscule.
This may also be above your pay grade.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
But it occurred to me that the aquifers that go under Israel also go into the Palestinian territories. And if you could think about the possibility of including a Palestinian university in one of these shared research opportunities, then it might help international politics.
Way above my pay grade. But I would say if you read the New York Times or whatever other paper you like to read in the morning, that just last week there was a very large article on the water agreements between Jordan and Israel and the Palestinians.
Oh, what's your
Yeah, and it has to do with, and it made a point that in spite of the breakdown of recent negotiations and peace, that these kind of things just have to go forward. And there's issues of having water where you need it. And so I'm not expert in that agreement. I read it over my morning coffee. But what it really talked about was increasing the rights of Israel to withdraw water from the Sea of Galilee, and in return having water in the south that Israel has that could be distributed to Jordan and the Palestinians in various ways. So, there is, water is life to everybody there, and they all know it. Yeah.
Yes. when I first started here at the University of Chicago, and rivers were on fire in Cleveland, and you know, we had all sorts of really serious water pollution problems, and that seemed to be the big water problem when I was here. I mean, obviously there were people still without water, but are the things you're working on, are they now being used in pollution technologies and things like that, these filters, or is that a completely separate issue from what this is?
No, it's a moving bar. Every water plant, if you look at the plant out, you know, a mile or so in Lake Michigan, you can see it on a clear day like today. You know, that water comes in, it has silt, if you will. So there's filtering of macroscopic junk, of micron particles, nanofiltration, sedimentation, biologicals, chemical cleanup. Maybe you add a little ozone to burn out the organics. You add some fluorine so your teeth stay put, and then you can drink it. And so these filters are, I mean, they're everywhere all the time. And it goes back to what I said. What you either want to do one of two things. It's the mantra. You want to do what you're doing currently better, or you want to invent a revolutionary way of doing a similar thing. There may be more, but those two really suffice for me. Yeah.
Getting back to, I don't know if you can address this, but is any thought being given to changing behavior, particularly in the United States? Because I mean, I remember growing up as a child, I brushed my teeth and just never even think about turning the soft faucet off.
Yeah.
But that changed a while ago. I mean, and I've read about how Americans never used to put their seatbelts on until maybe they were being fined if they weren't. But certain things we can change our behavior. It's difficult to do, but it can be done. Is there any part of any of this that discusses this is the way we currently live, this is the American lifestyle, and maybe some of that needs to be changed?
Well, I think anybody from Booth here? I mean, I think it comes down not to costs. I mean, frankly, you know, in California, I was a graduate student there, not here. Sorry, you know, a long time ago, probably when the rivers were on fire, and it turned out that there was a dreadful water shortage in the late 70s in California, deeper than today. And I remember they suddenly had bricks that you had to put into your toilet bowls, right? So that you use less water per flush. And then you now can't buy the 6-gallon, I think, per flush toilets. They're what, 2 or 3 or 1.8, you know, whatever Home Depot sells. So it comes from federal law or law in California, which frankly is such a large market, means that everything in the country needs to follow. Actually, that's why it happens, right? And so the answer to your question, in part, is costs and regulation and telling your kids to get out of the shower in the morning, you know? But I think what I really wanted to also say is I did show one slide where it showed that for the gallons of water used in your own household, which are precious, behind that there's a tremendous amount of water for food supply and for power. Factor of 10 more than factor of 10 more. And so it's the overall system that has to be improved. And it's a lot easier to deal with, you know, agriculture revolutions have occurred in Israel out of absolute necessity. And that technology is going to spread around the world. It is spreading around the world. And, you know, modified crops that can use less water are certainly happening. And as you know, there are issues with genetically modified food. But, you know, it's above my pay grade for the third time. But, you know, whether I cross two plants and make a new plant in my garden or Monsanto engineers it, it to me is identical. Just one of them is done the old-fashioned way and one is done in a modern way. But that's an issue for politics, too. Yeah.
Steve, I think we have
one last question here. Yeah, in the back. Yeah.
Did you say earlier in your talk that some of the water that is used is never replaced? That is to say, it is lost forever rather than being recycled.
Oh, let me qualify that. I tried to be clear, but I'll answer that again. You know, if you are watering your lawn in the morning, if you have a lawn, then that's water that comes out of the hose, and it goes into the earth, and it sinks, and maybe it evaporates and makes clouds or something, right? So that's what I mean by water that's lost. I mean, it served a purpose when it was used. That's different than having a tank for a cooling system for refrigerating a skyscraper. There you have water that's recirculating. So you're using water there, but it goes around and around. When you use water for agriculture, it's once used. I mean, yes, it goes back and it makes rain, but it's lost to this. And if it's fresh water that's precious, it's lost. Yeah. So there's a slight difference there. It largely evaporates. It depends upon, where you are. Yeah. Okay. Okay, last question.
I'm sorry. Very interesting research, obviously. Are there any other universities that have made water research other than Ben-Gurion University, Chicago? And if so, who are they that are also leading this push towards advancements in this material?
Yeah, it's clearly a worldwide effort. It's a worldwide effort. I mean, the question is, where do you have a confluence of expertise in, I'd say, nanoscience type technology, which is going to be very important for this discussion, and materials research, and law and economics. And so we feel we are going to grow into a major player, even though we're just started this year. So that's the plan. Yeah. But, I mean, it's clear that water resources, it's a central issue along with energy, that energy-water nexus. That's the issue of a generation. Yeah. Okay? Thank you. Thank you.